Welcome everyone to another episode of Retro Wrestling Reviews. Fredo Esparza here, and this week we look back at Mid-South Wrestling's December 17th, 1981 episode. This episode was taped on December 9th, 1981 at the Irish McNeil's Boys Club in Shreveport, Louisiana. Boyd Pierce is joined by Ted DiBiase this week on commentary. Pierce reminds fans to send in their votes for their dream matches. He mentions Dusty Rhodes, Andre the Giant, and Ted DiBiase are on upcoming shows. And the Samoans, Afa and Sika, will be returning after serving their suspension. Pierce and DiBiase also talk about Orndorff and Roop coming up with a counter to the figure four leg lock. The first match on the show features Brian Blair beating Tom Renesto Jr. with the figure four leg lock, which was oddly enough the move that they had just talked about because of DiBiase actually mastering that hold and Orndorff and Roop countering it. So of course the first match has that as a finisher. This was a short match with Blair controlling most of the match. Pretty much just an okay, quick match to open the show. That is then followed by Precious Paul Ellering getting a win over Don Serrano after a leg drop followed by a neck breaker. Prior to the match, Ellering was interviewed about his return after missing 6 months due to injury. This was one of the things with the Paul Ellering is that for the most part, much of his wrestling career had a lot of moments where he was out with injuries, which is pretty much why he transitioned more into becoming a manager because he could actually talk. So they turned him into a manager. He gained fame with the Road Warriors, the Legion of Doom. In this interview, he speaks in third person. He talks about how he loves America and the foot-long hot dog. He was very much a babyface, all-American type of wrestler. He challenges the Iron Sheik to the Persian Club Challenge, which will happen later on during the show. But like I said, this match was pretty quick squash match with Ellering getting the win. That is then followed by the Junkyard Dog beating Mike Boyer with a big thump body slam. There is a mention of JYD having just won the Louisiana title from the Great Kabuki just a few days prior. Mike Boyer, for many of you who are not familiar with him, would later return to UWF as Mike Boyette, but he also was part of one half of the tag team of the Hippies with Irish Mickey Doyle. And actually, Mike Boyer was a really good, what you call jobber or enhancement talent. And he does this very well against Junkyard Dog, where he's bumping all over the place for JYD. This was an okay squash match also. Very short. Most of the matches from this point are very short. And there's a few more that follow. For the most part, all of them are really short. That is then followed by Paul Orndorff and Bob Orton Jr. beating Carlos Zapata and the Monk, with Orndorff getting the Monk to submit to the figure four leg lock. Again, this is continuation of the whole controversy around Ted DiBiase's figure four leg lock and how Orndorff and Bob Roop had figured out how to counter it. Orndorff and Orton Jr. had really good tag team chemistry, they worked very quickly in this match. Again, this was another short match, but I really liked what Orndorff and Orton Jr. were doing in this match. That was then followed by definitely the best match on this show. Bob Roop beating Mike George after getting in a few knees into the corner on George and getting the pin. This was a very back and forth type of match. Roop was very aggressive in this. George was able to match up with him. Of course, George being more of a featured wrestler at this point in time in Mid-South Wrestling, so he actually gets a little bit more offense in these matches and even gets a few more wins out there, especially given that he was a former North American heavyweight champion as well. So there's a little bit more history with him there at this point in time, a little more of a fan following that knew who he was. I think later on when he made his return, when Mid-South became UWF, there wasn't that same fan following that kind of understood who George was, so he was more of just kind of like not necessarily a jobber, but kind of like in the middle of the card where he was somebody that was going to be competitive in his matches, but you knew he wasn't going to win. But here he actually had a shot against Roop, but Roop ended up winning. Roop was really good in the early on, especially during this Mid-South run. After that match, we get Ed Wiskowski, who gets the win over Mike Bond in another very quick match. Wiskowski slams Bond into his knee and gets the pin. Very short. Like I mentioned, Wiskowski gains fame as Colonel De Beers, but this was, I mean, this was probably even the shortest match on the show. For whatever reason, they were just going through every single match as quickly as possible, and that's what happened with this one. That was then followed by Iron Sheik and Paul Ellering having their $1,000 Persian Club Challenge. General Skandar Akbar accompanies the Iron Sheik. Ellering starts off the challenge lifting the clubs up 50 times, which upsets the Iron Sheik. Akbar then tells everyone that the Iron Sheik has a match, so he'll wrestle Frank Monty first and do his part of the challenge after. Akbar even ups the ante to $2,000 just so everybody can wait patiently. So the Iron Sheik has his match and he defeats Frank Monty after a belly to back suplex. This was again another short match. Monty got some offense in, but Sheik kept stopping him until he was able to get the win. Very short match. This match ends, and again, Ellering returns to the ring for the challenge. General Skandar Akbar is very upset because the Iron Sheik just had a grueling match with an international star and asks if this is American justice to have him complete the challenge after a match. Akbar stalls enough for TV time to run out, and the announcers mentioned the challenge will go on next week's show. Thought this show was better than the previous weeks. Still a lot more squash matches, and when your best match on your show is Bob Roop versus Mike George, it's really kind of not a strong show. Usually the more competitive matches in Mid-South usually featured Ted DiBiase, and then during this time period also Paul Orndorff. But Roop is still very good, but I don't think this was something that was necessarily a strong show. But it kind of shows you that there's more of a story. There's more storylines involved on this episode, especially with what's going on with the Iron Sheik and Precious Paul Ellering. And then you also have what's going on with DiBiase, Bob Roop, and Paul Orndorff. Most of the matches were kept relatively short. Best match again on the show was Bob Roop versus Mike George. Show does move quickly, so if you want to watch every episode, this was definitely worth a watch. So definitely I do recommend, if you have the time, watch it, especially if you're somebody who wants to watch everything in a certain order and want to be consistent, just because you not only are you watching for the wrestling, but you're watching for the storylines. Yeah, give it a view if you have time. It is available on the WWE Network. I think this one is also on somewhere on YouTube. You just have to track it down. But I think the early shows are there. Then there's like a more of a, there's not as many available on YouTube. But if you have the WWE Network, you could find it there. Be sure to subscribe to the Retro Wrestling YouTube channel, where we'll have more wrestling show reviews as well as the Lucha World podcast and other content available. Also, be sure to visit the website retrowrestling.com for classic wrestling reviews, and for Lucha, visit my website luchaworld.com. For added content, you could check us out on Patreon at patreon.com/luchaworld, where you'll get Lucha Magazine recaps, the Lucha Classica podcast, where we look back at old Lucha Libre, not too old, just from across the history of Lucha Libre, old to very more modernish Lucha. And we also have the Retro Wrestling podcast. Also, you have I also post some videos up there as well. You have to sign up to the $5 reward tier to get that. So thanks again, everyone, and talk to you guys again very soon.